I never thought I would say this out loud, but there was a time in my life when I genuinely believed I was born to fail. I remember staring at the ceiling at night, wondering why nothing ever worked out for me. I wasn't the guy people respected. I wasn't the guy women noticed. I wasn't even the guy who had direction in life. I was just invisible. I wasn't ugly, but I was ordinary. I wasn't stupid, but I lacked drive. I wasn't broken, but I wasn't whole either. And when you live in that gray area between mediocrity and emptiness, you start to believe that maybe that's all there is for you. I'd see guys getting attention, admiration, love, even if they weren't better than me. But somehow, I was always the one left behind. The one who got the "you're a nice guy, but" speech. The one who got ghosted after one date. The one who worked hard in silence and still went unnoticed. The worst part wasn't the rejection, it was the slow erosion of my self-worth. Every unanswered message, every forced smile from a girl who was clearly bored, every social event where I felt like a background character, it all added up. I tried everything they told me: be confident, be nice, be available. But none of it worked. And the more I tried to please people, the more I disappeared in their eyes. Until one day something snapped inside me. It wasn't a dramatic moment, it was subtle. A quiet evening, sitting in my room, scrolling through the same recycled motivational content, and stumbling across a quote that hit me harder than anything I had ever read: "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Seneca. That one sentence cracked something open in my soul. I didn't even know what Stoicism was. But those words echoed in my head like a warning and a promise. That night I started researching, digging deeper, reading, watching, reflecting. And the more I understood the principles of Stoic philosophy, the more I realized that the problem wasn't out there. It was in me. I was living as a victim of emotion, of expectations, of illusions. And the moment I shifted my focus inward, everything began to change. I wasn't chasing validation anymore. I was chasing discipline. I wasn't asking, "Why don't they want me?" I was asking, "What kind of man am I becoming?" And from that point on, my transformation began. This is not a fairy tale, it's not a quick fix. It's a brutal journey through self-awareness, silence, rejection, rebuilding, and power. And in this video, I'm going to tell you exactly how I went from being overlooked and rejected to becoming a man that women crave and people respect. This is my story, this is the truth, and I promise you, if you listen until the end, it just might change your life too. I still remember the exact moment I hit rock bottom. Not because it was some grand event, but because it was so painfully ordinary. I was sitting at a cafe with a girl I had been texting for weeks. She looked stunning, effortlessly beautiful, in that way that made me feel even more invisible. The conversation was hollow, forced, like I was trying to impress someone who had already decided I wasn't worth her time. I laughed at jokes that weren't funny. I complimented her too much. I nodded nervously, trying to keep things flowing. And yet, deep down, I knew she wasn't present. Her eyes scanned the room every few minutes. Her responses grew shorter. And when her phone vibrated and she looked at it with a sudden smile, I knew what was coming. "Hey, sorry," she said, grabbing her bag with fake urgency. "Something came up, I'll text you, okay?" But she didn't. And I knew she wouldn't. That walk home felt like a funeral, except I wasn't mourning her. I was mourning who I had become. A desperate version of myself who begged for scraps of attention, who twisted himself to fit someone else's expectations, who confused being agreeable with being worthy. That night, I stared at my reflection in the mirror for hours. Who was this man? Or better yet, who had I let myself become? I wasn't just rejected by women. I was rejected by my own self-respect. I had spent years playing nice, hiding my real voice, my real opinions, my real energy just to be liked. And where had that led me? Nowhere. I remembered my old friend Lucas, the guy who always seemed to have it all figured out. Confident, direct, quiet, yet commanding. Women gravitated toward him without him trying. People respected him even though he barely spoke. I used to envy him, even judge him silently, thinking he was just lucky or naturally gifted. But now I understood. He wasn't lucky. He just had something I didn't. He had internal strength. I called him that night. I don't know what I was hoping for. Advice maybe, or just someone to listen. He answered on the second ring. "What's up, man?" he said, calm as always. I hesitated for a second before speaking. "Lucas, I think I'm broken." There was a pause. "What happened?" I told him everything. The date, the rejection, the way I felt, the emptiness, the humiliation. He didn't interrupt once. He just listened. And when I finally stopped talking, he said something that changed my life. "You're not broken, brother. You're just out of alignment. You've been living for other people. That's why everything feels off." "So what do I do?" I asked. "You reset your mind," he said. "You rebuild from the inside. And you start by studying the only philosophy that ever made sense to me. Stoicism." I was silent. Stoicism? I had heard the word, but I didn't really know what it meant. "Yeah," he replied. "It's not a religion. It's not motivation. It's mental armor. It's how I became who I am today. And if you're serious about changing your life, it's where you begin." That conversation stayed with me. The next day, I looked up the word. I read about Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca. I watched videos. I started reading meditations. At first, it felt foreign. The ideas were deep, raw, direct, but something about them clicked. The concept that you can't control what happens, only how you respond. The idea that emotions are natural, but surrendering to them is weakness. The notion that pain is part of growth, and comfort is the real enemy. It was like reading the truth I had always felt but never knew how to express. I began to realize how I had lived as a slave to emotion, letting rejection dictate my self-worth, letting attention define my identity, letting comfort destroy my drive. But knowing wasn't enough. I had to act. So I started making changes, small ones. I stopped chasing conversations. I stopped explaining myself to people who didn't care. I stopped reacting emotionally to every disappointment. I remember the first test. Another girl who had been flaky with me for weeks suddenly texted. Old me would have responded instantly. But this time I waited. I didn't even reply. And something strange happened. I felt power, real power, not because I was playing a game, but because I finally understood that I didn't need to respond to everything. I didn't need to prove anything. I was learning to reclaim my energy, and people noticed. At work, I started speaking less but with more clarity. I stopped smiling out of obligation. I stopped saying yes to everything. I started waking up earlier. I started working out, not to impress, but to build discipline. I stopped scrolling for hours and started journaling every night. And slowly, very slowly, I felt a shift inside me. My thoughts became sharper, my presence became heavier. My eyes looked different in the mirror, not desperate anymore, but focused. And women, they noticed. The same women who used to ignore me were now initiating conversations. One even said, "You've changed. I can't explain it, but something about you feels so different." That's when I knew it was working, not because of their reaction, but because of my own reflection. I was becoming a man I respected, but I wasn't even close to done. I still had layers to peel, habits to break, pain to process. The journey had only begun, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the road. I was ready to walk it slowly, quietly, deliberately. Because I knew now that success wasn't something you chased. It was something you attracted by becoming aligned internally. And Stoicism wasn't just a philosophy. It was a weapon, a compass, a mirror. And I was going to use it to rebuild every corner of my life. I didn't realize how much power I had been giving away until I started taking it back. Every time I said yes when I meant no, every time I laughed just to be liked, every time I chased approval, it was like handing pieces of myself over to the world. And now, I was reclaiming them one by one. But don't get me wrong, it wasn't a smooth transition. Growth isn't linear. The first few weeks after embracing Stoicism were the hardest. The silence was loud, the solitude was heavy, and the temptation to fall back into old habits was always there, lurking. I'd wake up some mornings and think, what if this is just a phase? What if I'm just pretending to be someone I'm not? But then I'd remember a passage from Epictetus that said, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. That line hit me every time I doubted myself. Because yes, I did look different, I did act differently, and some people didn't get it. At work, a few colleagues started whispering, he's changed. He's colder now. He thinks he's better than us. I heard it all, but I didn't respond. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. Because I was no longer living to be understood. I was living to be aligned. That's something Stoicism taught me early on. Your energy is too valuable to waste on defending yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. And surprisingly, the less I explained myself, the more people respected me. It was strange, at first. When you stop seeking approval, you start attracting admiration. Not the loud, fake kind, but the silent kind. The kind that makes people look twice when you walk into a room. The kind that makes women glance, then glance again. The kind that shifts conversations from small talk to silence when you speak. I wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. I was simply becoming someone I respected. And that energy, that calm self-possession, it spoke louder than any words ever could. One day, I ran into Amanda. Remember her? The girl who left me hanging at that cafe weeks earlier. She spotted me in a bookstore of all places. She smiled and said, "Wow, I almost didn't recognize you. You look different." I just nodded politely. "Life changes you," I replied. "You've changed," she said again, this time with curiosity in her eyes. "You seem, I don't know, calmer, stronger?" I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The old me would have jumped at the chance to reconnect. But now I wasn't chasing ghosts from the past. I was too busy building my future, and that was the difference. She kept asking questions. How I was, what I'd been up to, where I'd been. I answered briefly, then turned the conversation to a book I was holding. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. She asked what it was about. I looked at her and said, "It's about mastering yourself so no one else can." She smiled. "That's deep. I should read that." I smiled back. "Maybe. But it only works if you're ready to change." And that was the first time I realized I no longer needed anyone's attention. I had become the center of my own gravity. My presence was no longer shaped by how people treated me. It was shaped by how I treated myself. And that internal shift began to bleed into every area of my life. I stopped rushing. I started walking slower, speaking slower, observing more. I started to enjoy silence, solitude, discipline, and I started creating space. Space in my schedule, space in my mind, space in my life for the things that actually mattered. I realized how much time I used to waste, chasing, scrolling, overthinking, worrying about things I couldn't control. Now I use that time to build. I built my body, I built my finances, I built my habits, and most importantly, I built my mind. Because I finally understood the core principle of Stoicism. External success means nothing if your internal world is still in chaos. My friends started noticing the change too. Some respected it. Others felt threatened. One of them, João, pulled me aside one evening. "Man, you've become so distant. I feel like you're turning into a monk or something." I chuckled. "I'm not distant," I said. "I'm just selective now." He laughed awkwardly. "So you're saying we're distractions?" I looked him in the eye. "No. I'm saying I can't keep living the same way I used to. I've wasted too much time already." He didn't say anything after that. But I saw it in his face. Confusion, maybe a bit of envy. Because deep down, people can sense when someone is evolving. It disrupts their comfort zone. It forces them to question their own stagnation, and not everyone is ready for that. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I wasn't living to be accepted. I was living to be exceptional, and with every small step, every quiet discipline, I felt myself rising, not above others, but above who I used to be. One night I sat on my balcony watching the city lights. I thought about all the years I spent in emotional slavery, all the times I begged for love, all the times I played small, all the times I hid my truth just to be liked. And I made a silent promise to myself, never again would I allow weakness to govern me. Never again would I hand over my power for approval. Never again would I dim my light to fit someone else's comfort. Because now I understood what it truly meant to be a man, not just a male, not just a guy, but a man with direction, with discipline, with presence. A man forged by solitude, sharpened by rejection, driven by purpose, and guided by reason. That's what Stoicism was giving me. Not a philosophy, but a framework. Not inspiration, but a code. And slowly I wasn't just learning it. I was living it, becoming it. And that was only the beginning. People often think transformation is this big dramatic event like a thunderstorm that suddenly shakes everything. But the truth is, real change is quieter. It's not loud or theatrical. It's subtle, internal, steady. And it begins with the way you respond to small moments. I realized this one afternoon when I was walking home from the gym. My body was aching, my shirt soaked in sweat, and I passed by a group of girls laughing on a bench. One of them looked at me, then turned to whisper something to her friend. They all giggled, and for a second I felt that old sting rise in my chest. That familiar voice. They're laughing at you. You're still the same guy they ignored before. But then I paused and asked myself, does it matter? Is that reaction within my control? No. What was within my control was how I responded to it. So I kept walking. Head straight, calm steps, no shift in posture, no emotional reaction. And you know what? The one who looked at me first looked again, this time not with mockery but with intrigue. That's when I realized the shift wasn't just physical, it was psychological. My presence was changing. My silence was louder than ever. I remember a moment shortly after that when I bumped into Clara, a girl I had liked back in university. Back then she barely noticed me. I was the invisible friend, the harmless guy in the background. But this time, something was different. "Hey," she said, almost surprised. "Wow, you look different." I smiled. "Yeah, life's been different too." We exchanged a few words, nothing special, but the way she looked at me, there was curiosity now. Not pity, not disinterest, curiosity. And that alone spoke volumes. But I wasn't the same guy who would have jumped at her attention. I wasn't there to impress her. I wasn't there to seek validation. I was just living my life aligned with my values, not hers. That's what most men don't understand. Women don't chase men who chase them. They chase men who chase purpose. And I was finally learning to chase mine. Still, the process wasn't linear. Some days I felt powerful. Others I questioned everything. One night I sat with Lucas again. We were drinking tea, not alcohol. Another change in habit. "You're growing fast," he said. "But growth can make people around you uncomfortable." I nodded. "I feel it. Some friends have distanced themselves. Even family sometimes acts weird." He leaned back. "Because you're evolving beyond their frame. You're challenging their identity without even trying. And that scares them. Don't let it stop you," I sighed. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of not knowing." He looked at me seriously. "Ignorance is comfortable, but greatness is never born in comfort. You're shedding the old you. That's supposed to be painful." That conversation stayed with me. Every time doubt crept in, I remembered those words. But it wasn't just doubt I faced. It was temptation. The temptation to go back to comfort, to reach out to old flings when loneliness hit, to skip the gym on lazy mornings, to waste time scrolling instead of reading. But every time I reminded myself, this pain is the cost of power, and I chose to pay it. I developed a mantra I repeated daily: discipline over distraction, direction over emotion, action over words. And that simple phrase became my armor, because temptation never stops, it just adapts. And unless you're constantly sharpening your mind, it will creep back in. So I trained my discipline like a muscle, not just in the gym, but in life. I started walking to work instead of driving, cold showers instead of comfort, journaling instead of complaining. It wasn't about being extreme, it was about being intentional. And the more intentional I became, the more I discovered another truth. Life rewards men who move in silence but act with precision. Women started noticing it too. I wasn't chasing them, but they started appearing, initiating conversations, asking questions, sending messages. I remember one girl, Helena, who used to ignore my texts for months. Out of nowhere, she sent a message. "Hey, been a while. How are you?" Old me would have jumped at it. New me didn't even respond. Why? Because I wasn't interested in the past. I was too busy building my future, and that's what Stoicism teaches you. Not to suppress emotion, but to redirect it. Not to avoid people, but to elevate your standards so that only the worthy can stay. And the moment you do that, your life filters itself. You stop attracting chaos. You start attracting alignment. Even my relationship with my family shifted. My father, who used to criticize everything I did, started sitting quietly when I spoke. My mother noticed I wasn't complaining anymore. "You're calmer these days," she said once. I just smiled. "I'm learning to control what I can and let go of what I can't." They didn't fully understand, but they respected it, and that was enough. The more I applied Stoicism, the more I felt untouchable, not because I was better than anyone, but because I was no longer a slave to external validation. And it reflected in everything: my work, my body, my finances, my conversations. People started asking me for advice. Women started admiring me for my presence, not just appearance. And all I did was stop chasing and start embodying. But I wasn't done yet, because transformation isn't a destination, it's a direction. And I knew that for every layer I peeled, another would emerge. The next stage of my journey was about refinement, about becoming not just powerful but precise, not just respected but revered, not just stable but stoic in the face of storms. And I was ready for it. There comes a point in every man's transformation when the internal shift becomes undeniable to everyone around him. It no longer requires explanation. You don't need to say anything. People feel it. You enter a room and something changes. Eyes follow you not because you're loud, but because you're grounded. You don't demand attention. You command it by simply being. That's where I was heading. But getting there didn't happen overnight. It took deliberate practice, daily battles in silence, the kind no one applauds you for, the kind that makes you question yourself when no one is watching. But that's the part most people skip. They want the results without the repetition. They want respect without refinement. They want admiration without internal alignment. But the truth is, nothing external can sustain you if your internal foundation is weak. One day I had lunch with an old colleague, Gustavo. He was one of those guys who always looked confident, always had stories about girls, money, and parties. But as we sat there talking about life, I noticed something strange. He was constantly checking his phone, his eyes restless, his tone nervous. He looked at me and said, "Man, you've really changed. You're so calm. Like nothing shakes you anymore." I smiled. "I've just stopped letting external things dictate my inner state." He laughed. "Easy to say, but I can't imagine living like that." I leaned in. "That's because you haven't been broken enough yet." He looked confused. "What do you mean?" I took a sip of water. Real calm doesn't come from comfort, it comes from surviving storms. When life hits you so hard that nothing outside you can shake what's inside you anymore, that's when you become truly untouchable. That moment stuck with me. Because most men don't understand that peace isn't soft. It's forged in chaos. It's earned through rejection, solitude, discipline, and detachment. And I was learning that daily. Even in my routines, my mornings were now sacred. Wake up before sunrise, cold shower, journaling, Workout, silence, no distractions, no scrolling, just me versus me. That structure changed everything. It gave me a rhythm, a tempo, a mental cadence that no one could interrupt. And as I stayed consistent, my results multiplied. My physique improved. My work performance skyrocketed. My speech became slower, sharper, more deliberate. And people began treating me differently, not because I asked, but because I became different. That's the part they don't tell you. When you become a man of internal order, the external world reorders itself around you. Women felt it too. I wasn't chasing them, I wasn't flirting, I wasn't seeking attention. Yet now they were the ones initiating conversations, asking questions, complimenting my energy. I remember one particular moment at a bookstore event. A girl named Beatrice approached me. "You look like you're always in control of everything," she said, half smiling. I looked at her and replied, "Only of what I can control. The rest I let go." She stared at me for a second, then said, "That's rare." And that was the difference. I wasn't trying to impress anymore. I was just expressing my essence, and that essence was built through silence, not show. But the deeper I went, the more I understood that this journey was about mastery, not over others, but over myself, my triggers, my reactions, my doubts. I started noticing how many moments in life are invitations to regress, small tests disguised as temptations. An old flame texts you, a toxic friend returns, a party you used to crave, a habit that calls your name when no one's watching. But Stoicism taught me to pause, to observe, to ask, does this serve the man I'm becoming? If the answer was no, I let it go. That one question became my compass, and with it I started shedding layers of identity that weren't mine anymore. I remember another dialogue with Lucas. "You're becoming dangerous," he said during one of our walks. "Not because you fight, but because you don't react. You're unreadable now." I nodded. "It's not about hiding, it's about mastering," he smiled. "Most men don't get that. They confuse emotional outbursts with strength." I laughed. "Let them. The real power is silent." And that was my truth now. My silence was my loudest statement, my discipline, my armor, my self-respect, my currency. I began to understand another level of attraction too. It wasn't just physical. It wasn't charm or flirting. It was presence. Women feel it when you've mastered yourself. They feel it in your eye contact, in your posture, in your tone, in your ability to say no without explanation. And the irony is, when you stop trying to attract them, that's when they become drawn to you uncontrollably. But by that point, you're no longer chasing connection. You're curating it. You're selective, intentional, because now you value your time, your energy, your peace too much to give it to just anyone. That's what Stoicism gives you. Not just confidence, but clarity. Not just presence, but purpose. And that's what separates a man who is wanted from a man who is needed. I was becoming the latter, but it came with sacrifices. Not everyone could come with me. Some friendships faded. Some people labeled me arrogant, cold, distant. But I didn't argue. I didn't defend. Because I understood now. Evolution always feels like arrogance to those who refuse to grow. So I kept walking. Quietly, relentlessly, stoically, because I knew where I was going, even if they didn't. And in that path, I was discovering something deeper than power or attraction. I was discovering peace, the kind of peace that can't be shaken, the kind that makes you magnetic. And that, more than anything, was worth every moment of solitude, every test of discipline, every silent night of self-confrontation. Because now I wasn't just becoming a man, I was becoming a force. One of the most unexpected consequences of my transformation was how other men started treating me. I didn't see it coming. I wasn't trying to be a role model, a mentor, or some kind of guru. I was simply focused on my own journey, building silently. But one by one, men started noticing. They'd come up to me at the gym, at work, at social gatherings. "Man, I don't know what it is, but you carry yourself differently now. How did you build that level of calm, that presence? You're not like you used to be. What changed?" At first, I didn't know how to answer. I'd just shrug and say, "Discipline, mostly." But I realized something deeper was happening. My transformation wasn't just about me anymore. It was starting to affect others. My silence became their mirror. My presence became their wake-up call. I could see it in their eyes. The quiet discomfort when they stood next to me, realizing how much of their own potential they were wasting. And without saying a word, I was pushing them to evolve. That's when I truly understood the weight of self-mastery. It's not about being better than anyone. It's about becoming so focused, so solid, so unshakable, that others can't help but feel their own chaos in your presence. One day, a younger guy named Raphael from my gym approached me, nervous, fidgety, unsure. "Hey man, sorry to bother you, but how did you get like this?" I paused. "Like what?" "I don't know, just focused, strong, disciplined. You don't seem distracted like the rest of us." I nodded slowly. "Pain," I said. "Pain showed me who I really was. And then Stoicism taught me how to rebuild him." He looked confused. I smiled. "Start by mastering your mornings. That's where everything changes." He thanked me and walked away. But I could see it. Something inside him had shifted. A spark. A seed. And I realized this was bigger than me now. I was walking proof that any man could rise if he was willing to let go of the weakness that kept him trapped. And the more I lived by that code, the more the world mirrored it back to me. Women sensed it too, not just in words, but in how I moved, how I responded, how I didn't flinch in discomfort. One of them, a woman who once left me on red for days, crossed paths with me again at a networking event. Her tone was different now. Her posture different. "There's something about you now," she said softly. "You've grown." I didn't respond with arrogance. I simply smiled, because I knew she wasn't complimenting my appearance. She was reacting to my essence. And that's what Stoicism gives you, an essence so sharp, so precise, it cuts through superficiality without a word. But the deeper I went, the more I discovered new enemies, not external ones, but internal. Pride, arrogance, isolation. See, when you start to evolve, there's a subtle temptation to believe you're above others, that you've figured it all out. And that's the most dangerous illusion of all. So I reminded myself constantly, humility is not weakness, it's strength under control. Discipline without humility becomes tyranny. Power without wisdom becomes destruction. And I wasn't on this path to become untouchable, I was on it to become unshakable. There's a difference. One is driven by ego, the other by truth. So I kept grounding myself in the teachings. I'd reread passages from Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, not just to remember, but to reinforce. One quote stood out to me. "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." That became my new filter, not perfection, not approval, just embodiment. And ironically, the more I focused inward, the more women pursued me outwardly. But I wasn't swayed anymore. I was no longer that boy chasing connection. I had become the man who curated it. Selective, centered, silent. And that made me magnetic. But it also made me aware of a deeper truth. Women don't want a man who obeys their every wish. They want a man who obeys his own principles, who can love without losing himself, who can lead without dominating, who can walk away, not to manipulate, but because his peace is non-negotiable. And that's who I was becoming. One woman I dated, for a short time, noticed it. She said, "I've never met a man who doesn't need me, but still chooses to be present." That's when I knew I had reached a new level. Not because I was winning her approval, but because I was no longer dependent on it. But with growth comes pressure, higher standards, sharper boundaries. I started losing interest in empty conversations, superficial encounters, pointless distractions. And that's when I faced the next challenge: loneliness. Not the old kind where I felt unwanted, but a new kind where I felt unmatched. When you rise, your circle shrinks, not because you're better, but because fewer people can breathe the same altitude. And I had to make peace with that. Some nights I sat alone, wondering if this path was worth it, if I'd sacrificed too much. But then I'd look in the mirror and remember, I'm not chasing connection. I'm cultivating character. And that's a far more difficult but far more rewarding path. The world doesn't teach men how to build themselves. It teaches them to please, to perform, to conform. And that's why most men stay lost. But Stoicism was giving me a blueprint, a way out of that cycle. And I had no intention of turning back. Because every layer I peeled, every weakness I confronted, every test I passed, was bringing me closer to the man I always knew I could be. By the time I reached the next phase of my transformation, something inside me had become unrecognizable. Not in a chaotic way, but in a deeply aligned, structured, silent power that no longer depended on the outside world to function. I noticed it in the way I handled stress. Things that used to rattle me, delays, criticism, rejection, became irrelevant. Not because I had hardened, but because I had transcended. There's a difference between numbness and stillness. The first is weakness dressed as strength. The second is mastery disguised in calm. That was what I was becoming. Still, not numb. And with that stillness came a new dimension of self-awareness. I began to notice how my own thoughts used to sabotage me. Not people, not events. My own mind, my own insecurities, my own fears. Stoicism taught me that no enemy outside could ever destroy a man whose inner fortress is fortified. So I started rebuilding mine, brick by brick. Principle by principle, I spent more time in solitude. Not isolation, but solitude. The kind that sharpens clarity and purifies energy. I'd go on long walks with no phone, just my thoughts and the silence between them. I'd sit in cafes, not to scroll, but to observe. I started to enjoy being alone more than being entertained. And it wasn't out of bitterness, it was out of sovereignty. Because once you taste the peace that comes from not needing anything, it's impossible to go back to chasing everything. That's what most men never experience. They chase women, status, validation, thinking those things will make them feel complete. But nothing outside can heal what's fractured within. You don't attract better because you chase harder. You attract better because you become better. You elevate your internal frequency, and the external world eventually aligns with it. That was happening to me now, effortlessly. I remember an old coworker, Daniel, who saw me again after a year. His eyes widened. "Man, you look like a completely different person. What happened?" I smiled. I stopped trying to impress people who didn't value me, and I started becoming someone I valued. He nodded slowly, but I could see it. He didn't just hear my words, he felt the truth behind them. That's the power of embodiment. When you live what you speak, people feel it before you say a word. I didn't need validation anymore. Not from him, not from anyone. I was finally living by my own standards. And women, their reactions became even more intense. Not because I was trying to seduce them, but because I had become seduction in human form, not by looks, not by words, but by energy. The same women who once ignored me now tried to decode me. They'd say things like, "There's something about you, I can't explain it." That's because they weren't reacting to what they could see. They were reacting to what they could feel. My detachment, my direction, my discipline. Those three things became my signature. I wasn't emotionally available to chaos. I wasn't accessible to mediocrity. I wasn't reactive to games. And in a world where most men still flinch at rejection, I became the exception. But the path wasn't without resistance. The more I elevated, the more temptations appeared in disguise. Beautiful distractions, false praises, opportunities that looked good but carried hidden compromises. That's where the real test began. Not, Whether I could rise, but whether I could stay pure at the top. Because Stoicism doesn't just prepare you to grow, it trains you to remain. And that's harder. It's easy to rise when everything is fresh and exciting. It's harder to maintain when the silence grows thicker, when fewer people understand you, when your standards push away 99% of what used to satisfy you. But I chose to stay high, alone if needed, but high, because the pain of solitude is better than the comfort of self-betrayal. That's what I told myself one evening when a woman from my past tried to come back. She had ghosted me when I was nothing, ignored me when I had no power, but now she saw my evolution and wanted a second chance. She messaged me late at night. "I've been thinking about you. I miss our talks." Old me would have melted. New me didn't even flinch. I looked at the message, smiled, and put the phone down. Because I knew exactly what she missed. My attention, not my essence. And I don't give that away anymore. Not to those who only value me after others do. That's the power of walking away not with anger, but with purpose. You don't reject them. You simply rise so high that they no longer have access. I began mentoring younger men, not officially, but naturally. They'd ask questions, observe me, follow my routines, and I always told them the same thing. Your biggest enemy is not rejection, it's distraction. Master your mornings, master your mind, master your reactions, and watch how women, opportunities, and power follow you. One of them, Felipe, texted me months later. "Bro, I stopped chasing girls. Started waking up at 5, journaling, lifting, reading Stoic texts. You were right. Everything changed." That message hit deep because I knew I was doing something beyond me now. I was shaping men who would shape the world, but I stayed humble because I knew I wasn't immune to regression. So I kept training, kept refining, kept detaching, kept reading, kept walking in silence. Because once you stop evolving, you start decaying. And I had no intention of returning to that old version of myself. That man is dead, buried under discipline, forged in solitude, and replaced by a force no one saw coming. A man of value, a man of vision, a man no longer chasing, only attracting. And that is what Stoicism gave me. Not a strategy, but a standard. Not a goal, but a code. And I was just getting started. It's strange how over time you stop recognizing the man you used to be. Not because you hate him, but because he simply doesn't fit in your current skin anymore. That's what I felt every time I caught my reflection in a mirror. The same face, but not the same man. My posture had changed. My eyes didn't search for approval anymore. My shoulders carried not insecurity, but quiet assurance. And my silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. That's what people don't understand. The most powerful men don't speak to be heard, they speak when it matters. And most of the time, their silence speaks louder than any sentence could. I didn't chase conversations anymore. I didn't explain myself. I didn't engage in empty debates. I conserved my energy like gold, because I understood that energy was currency, and most people were bankrupt without even knowing it. One day I had coffee with a former classmate who used to ignore me during our university years. She sat across from me looking more curious than confident. "You've really changed," she said, almost studying my face. "You used to be so different." I nodded. I had to bury who I was to become who I am. She laughed nervously. "That sounds dramatic." I looked at her calmly. Evolution always sounds dramatic to those who never experienced it. She didn't respond right away, but I could see it. There was a shift in her demeanor, a subtle realization that she wasn't talking to the same man she remembered. That's the essence of real transformation. It doesn't need validation. It simply reveals itself in presence. And presence doesn't lie. I began to understand the deeper meaning behind all those Stoic teachings. Words I had once read for inspiration were now lived experiences. "You become what you give your attention to," Marcus Aurelius wrote. And I finally understood it on a visceral level. Attention is the most powerful form of investment. Where your attention goes, your life follows. And I had spent years investing mine in things that drained me, people who didn't value me, habits that numbed me, distractions that broke me. Now my attention was sacred. It went only to things that elevated me: books, training, building, solitude, learning, creating. And the return on that investment was priceless. Even in relationships, I became selective, not because I was cold, but because I finally understood that not every woman deserved access to a man of value. I wasn't trying to impress anymore, I was observing. I wasn't asking, does she like me? I was asking, does she qualify to stand beside the man I'm becoming? That shift changed everything. And women felt it. They could sense the difference between a man who needs them and a man who chooses them. Between a man who chases and a man who attracts. Between a man who performs and a man who simply is. One woman I briefly dated told me, "You make me nervous, like I'm the one trying to win you over." I smiled. You should be. A man who knows his worth is not easily impressed. And that was no longer a line. It was my truth. But with this level of awareness came a new test. Isolation disguised as elevation. The higher you rise, the quieter it becomes. Because few understand the language of self-mastery. They think you're arrogant. They think you're too intense. They mistake your boundaries for walls, your discipline for coldness, your silence for indifference. But you don't correct them. You don't argue. Because a man on a mission has no time to explain his purpose to people who live without one. So you keep walking, alone if necessary. Not because you want solitude, but because solitude is better than settling. And that's a truth only those who've walked this path will ever understand. I remember one night, alone in my apartment, reading Epictetus by candlelight. The quote burned into my mind. Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control. I closed the book and looked around. No noise, no chaos, no distractions. Just peace. Not the kind sold by retreats or gurus, but the kind earned through internal warfare. That's what Stoicism gave me. Not comfort, but clarity. Not a shortcut, but a compass. And now, I moved through life like a man who knew exactly where he was going, even when others didn't understand the map. Even my career started to shift. I was no longer just performing tasks. I was building something with intention. People noticed, leadership noticed. Opportunities began to open, not because I networked more, but because my presence now spoke louder than my resume. I carried myself differently. I communicated differently. I made decisions differently. Not emotionally, but with reason. Not reactively, but strategically. That was the Stoic in me. And it was showing up in every area of my life. But what moved me the most was watching other men change just by being near me, not because I preached, but because I lived. And that's the greatest legacy, becoming so aligned with your code that others begin questioning their own. Men would pull me aside and say, "Man, you don't even talk much, but something about you makes me want to fix my life." I'd smile and say, "That's what presence does. It exposes what's missing in others." And I knew then that I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer just transforming. I had become transformation itself. What I came to realize in the later stages of my journey was that true mastery didn't come from accumulation. It came from elimination, not from doing more, but from doing less with greater depth. I started stripping away everything that didn't serve my purpose. Distractions, habits, people, environments, even outdated beliefs. I became surgical in my lifestyle. Every action had to have alignment with the man I was becoming. Every conversation had to add value, or it wasn't worth my breath. Every day was a battleground for mental clarity, and I wasn't willing to lose, because I knew that the moment I allowed chaos back in, I'd fall into the same traps I once swore I'd escape. So I stayed sharp. I stayed grounded. I stayed stoic. And that's when something deeper began to happen. People didn't just notice my behavior. They felt my energy shift. Colleagues at work started talking differently around me. Some became nervous, others intrigued. I wasn't intimidating by force, I was unshakable by nature. One afternoon, my supervisor pulled me aside. "You've become someone people look to without you even trying," he said. "It's like your presence brings order." I simply nodded, not out of pride, but because I understood it wasn't about me. It was about what I had become. That's the power of self-mastery. You stop reacting and start radiating. Not noise, but stillness. Not dominance, but composure. And the world around you rearranges itself to follow your tempo. Even strangers started approaching me. People I had never met before would start conversations, asking questions, trying to understand what made me different. They'd say things like, "There's something about your energy, can't explain it." And I'd think to myself, that's because it can't be explained, it has to be experienced. That's what Stoicism creates, a magnetic field around you. Not because you chase, but because you've become the kind of man people can't ignore. Not through noise, but through presence. And presence, I learned, is built in silence, not spotlight. But it wasn't just the world around me that changed. My internal world became more refined, more efficient, more aligned. I no longer wasted time in emotional spirals. I didn't dwell on what people said or did. I didn't take offense. I didn't retaliate. If something wasn't within my control, it wasn't worth my energy. I'd simply observe, breathe, decide, and move. That became my mantra. Observe, breathe, decide, move. 4 steps that created a mental fortress stronger than anything external. That's the difference between a man who lives emotionally and a man who lives intentionally. One reacts to life, the other designs it. And in this state of clarity, I started seeing through people. I could feel their insecurities behind their smiles. I could sense their masks beneath their compliments. I could read their true intentions not by what they said, but by what their energy projected. That's what Stoicism gives you. Emotional X-ray vision. You no longer judge people by appearances, you assess them by essence. And that gave me an advantage in every social interaction, every negotiation, every relationship, because while others were lost in superficiality, I was operating on depth. Women especially became more transparent to me. I could instantly tell who was there for status, who was there for comfort, and who was truly interested in growth. And once you develop that level of discernment, you stop wasting energy. You don't flirt for fun. You don't entertain chaos. You don't pursue attention. You protect your peace like it's sacred. Because it is. And ironically, that's when you become most attractive. Not because you're trying to be, but because your standards silently speak louder than any pickup line ever could. I remember a moment when I met a woman named Laura at an event. She was sharp, elegant, assertive. Most men gravitated toward her instantly, hoping to impress. But I didn't move. I observed. I stayed in my lane. And that's what caught her attention. Later that evening, she approached me. "You're not like the others," she said. "You didn't even look twice at me." I looked into her eyes and said, "Because I don't chase presence, I protect mine." She smiled, not because she was flattered, but because she had never heard a man speak like that. And from that moment, the dynamic shifted. She wasn't in control. I wasn't either. The energy was equal, pure, clear. And that's how powerful connections are formed. Not through performance, but through authenticity. But here's the hidden challenge of becoming a man of high value. The more magnetic you become, the more selective you must be, because now everyone wants access, but not everyone deserves it. So I had to sharpen my boundaries even further. I said no more often. I walked away faster. I trusted my gut without overthinking. And most importantly, I stopped explaining myself. Not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. Because a lion doesn't explain his roar. He simply exists, and the jungle responds. That's the kind of energy I embodied now. And it was in this energy that I started mentoring more men. Quietly, naturally, not from a pedestal, but from experience. I told them the truth most people are afraid to say. You're not supposed to feel ready. You're supposed to feel resistance, and that resistance is your training ground. One young man, Enrique, came to me frustrated. I'm tired of being ignored by women, tired of being overlooked. I looked at him and said, "You're not being overlooked. You're just not seen yet, and you won't be seen until you become undeniable, not in appearance but in essence." That conversation changed him. Months later, he messaged me. "I stopped chasing, started building. You were right. Now they come to me, but I don't even care anymore." That's when I knew he had made the shift, not just externally, but internally. And that's the shift every man must make if he truly wants to escape mediocrity. Because here's the truth no one tells you. Women don't want a man who worships them. They want a man who worships his purpose, who's so focused, so grounded, so aligned, that her presence becomes a compliment, not a necessity. That's the man I had become, not out of bitterness, not out of game, but out of alignment with my highest self. And I wasn't turning back. There's something no one tells you about rising. It's not just about becoming more, it's about being able to carry more. More responsibility, more influence, more eyes watching every step you take. And I started to feel that pressure. Not in a negative way, but in a way that reminded me how far I had come and how much I now represented. I was no longer just living for myself. My presence had become an anchor for those around me. My silence became instruction. My boundaries became inspiration. My discipline, once mocked, now admired. And I understood something profound. When a man transforms himself, he transforms everything he touches. His home, his relationships, his environment, his energy, all of it begins to rise with him. That's what I began witnessing daily. At my workplace, a colleague who used to procrastinate started showing up earlier because he saw me do it. A friend who once spent his weekends lost in distractions started reading Stoic Philosophy because he saw how it shaped me. Even my younger brother, once directionless, started asking deeper questions about purpose, routine, values, because he sensed the shift in me. And that's the ripple effect no one talks about. You don't need to preach to change people. You just need to embody, to live it, to walk it unapologetically. Because authenticity is contagious, and in a world drowning in performance, your consistency becomes revolutionary. But this new phase brought new challenges, especially with women. I started noticing something unexpected. Women weren't just attracted. They were intrigued, even intimidated. Not by aggression, not by dominance, but by my self-possession. They weren't used to a man who didn't seek approval, who didn't flinch under beauty, who didn't chase attention. One woman told me, "You make me feel like I need to be better just to be around you." That wasn't a compliment to my ego. It was a confirmation of my energy. Because that's what happens when you become the man you were meant to be. You challenge the very fabric of mediocrity. You force others to rise, or you leave them behind. But that's not easy. Because the higher you go, the more isolated you become. Not out of arrogance, but because alignment filters out anything that doesn't vibrate at your frequency. I lost contact with people I once called family. I outgrew circles that once felt like home. I had to accept that not everyone was meant to come with me. That hurt, but it was necessary, because holding on to what no longer serves you is the fastest way to sabotage everything you've built. So I let go, with grace, with peace, with clarity, and in that solitude I found power, a deeper kind, the kind that isn't loud but undeniable, the kind that doesn't beg to be seen but is impossible to ignore. That's when I stopped engaging in validation loops altogether. I no longer needed to explain why I did what I did. I no longer needed to prove my path. I simply moved with purpose, and that became enough. That's what Stoicism teaches you at its core. Nothing external can shake a man who's anchored internally. And once you realize that, you no longer fear rejection, loss, or failure, because you've detached from everything you can't control. You move by principle, not reaction. You lead yourself, and by doing so, you lead others, without even trying. One evening, I spoke at a small leadership workshop. I wasn't trying to impress, just share my story. I talked about the power of routine, detachment, presence, and discipline. And afterward, an older gentleman approached me. I've spent 40 years chasing success, but tonight I realized I never built peace. That sentence echoed in my mind for days. Because he was right. Most people chase the external world their entire life, and when they finally get it, they realize they never built an inner one. But I was building mine daily, deliberately, piece by piece, and that inner world became my fortress. I didn't depend on the opinions of women to feel valuable. I didn't depend on money to feel powerful. I didn't depend on compliments to feel confident. Everything I needed was inside. That's what made me truly magnetic. Not my clothes, not my physique, not my charm, but my groundedness. That quiet certainty that no matter what happened around me, I remained still within. And in a world addicted to chaos, that stillness became the rarest form of strength. At this point, I started building a new vision for my life. Not just goals, but legacy. What kind of man did I want to be remembered as? What impact did I want to leave on the men around me? I knew I had a duty now to show others that it's possible, that you can rise without losing your soul, that you can lead without oppressing, that you can evolve without performing, and that you can love without losing your power. That's what Stoicism gave me: clarity, code, compass. And now, I carried that code in everything I did. But I didn't stop learning. I didn't stop refining. Because the moment you think you've arrived, you begin to decline. I read more. I trained harder. I meditated deeper. I observed more closely. Because mastery isn't a destination. It's a way of living. It's how you breathe, how you walk, how you choose. And every choice, no matter how small, either reinforces your values or weakens them. So I stayed sharp. And that sharpness became my signature. People began inviting me to speak, to guide, to mentor, but I never let the recognition seduce me. Because I knew the truth. You're only as powerful as your discipline in private. And while the world may clap for you in public, your integrity is tested in silence. That's where you prove who you are when no one is watching. When you choose to rise even when no one will see it. When you stick to your code, not because it's easy, but because it's yours. By the final stage of my evolution, I had stopped looking for milestones. I wasn't chasing goals anymore. I was living by standards. There's a difference most people never understand. Goals are things you pursue. Standards are things you embody. And when you raise your standards, your entire life recalibrates. You stop settling. You stop chasing. You stop begging for what you've already outgrown. And that's what had happened to me. I had outgrown everything that once enslaved me. The version of me that begged for love, chased attention, performed for validation. That man was gone. Not buried in anger, not lost in bitterness, but transcended in silence. I no longer had to prove anything to anyone. I simply lived in such alignment that proof was in my presence. I no longer had to speak loudly. My energy spoke before my words ever did. And women, they didn't just notice, they felt it. I had become the opposite of what most of them were used to. I wasn't emotionally available for games. I wasn't a project to be fixed. I wasn't a puzzle to be manipulated. I was a fortress and steady, whole, deliberate. And that confused many of them. Some tried to test me. Others tried to pull me into old dynamics. But I didn't flinch, I didn't react, I didn't engage. Because when you've mastered yourself, chaos becomes boring. Noise becomes obvious. Drama becomes unappealing. I had no more interest in chasing a woman's attention. I had become the man whose presence demanded it effortlessly. Not by force, but by stillness. Not by charm, but by discipline. Not by games, but by groundedness. I once ran into a woman who had rejected me years before. Back then, I would have given anything for her attention. Now I barely recognized that version of myself. She walked up to me with a mix of nostalgia and confusion. "You've changed," she said, trying to mask the undertone of regret. I nodded. Growth tends to do that. She smiled softly. "You seem untouchable now." I looked her in the eyes and replied, "No, I've just stopped handing out pieces of myself to those who didn't value them." That was the moment I knew I was fully free. Because freedom isn't found in isolation, it's found in self-possession. When no one's opinion, no one's absence, no one's approval can alter your essence, you are truly free. And that's the message I began sharing with younger men who crossed my path. Not with arrogance, but with conviction. I'd tell them, "You're not weak for being emotional. You're weak for letting your emotions own you. Learn to feel everything, but obey nothing but your values." That's Stoicism in practice. It's not suppression, it's sovereignty. It's not emotional coldness, it's emotional command. It's not detachment from life, it's alignment with purpose. And once you step into that energy, you stop begging for recognition. You stop seeking softness in places that only offer chaos. You stop tolerating low-frequency relationships. You start living as the source, not the seeker. Even my physical body reflected the transformation. My training wasn't just physical anymore, it was spiritual. Every rep was a form of meditation. Every set was a declaration of discipline. Every drop of sweat was a baptism of resilience. And people noticed. Men began asking about my routine. Women began observing my demeanor. But I wasn't performing for any of them. I was simply honoring my code. A code written not by the world but by my own hands, carved through pain, sharpened through solitude, refined through purpose. One night, while journaling under dim light, I asked myself a final question. What is the true reward of this journey? And the answer came without hesitation. Peace. Not the peace sold by comfort zones, but the peace earned through war. Internal war. The kind of peace that cannot be bought, cannot be faked, cannot be disturbed. That's the true reward, not fame, not validation, not attention. Peace. And with that peace came the deepest level of power. The power to walk away from anything that doesn't align. The power to stand firm in any storm. The power to love deeply without losing yourself. The power to speak without shouting, to lead without forcing, to attract without chasing. I looked at my life, my routine, my relationships, my focus, my impact, and I realized I had built something sacred. Not a perfect life, but an intentional one. Not a life free of challenges, but a life full of clarity. I didn't need to impress. I didn't need to dominate. I didn't need to prove. I just needed to live fully aligned with the man I had become and let the rest fall into place. Because that's what true high-value men do. They don't chase validation. They don't beg for love. They don't shrink to fit comfort. They rise, silently, deliberately, unapologetically. And as they rise, they don't scream for attention. They create presence, they don't play games, they build standards. They don't follow trends. They walk with purpose. And by doing so, they become the rarest energy in the world. The man who is complete within himself. The man who doesn't need a woman to feel valuable, but whose presence makes any woman feel lucky to be chosen. And if you've listened to this entire story, you now understand. This wasn't just a story about rejection or heartbreak. This was the story of rebirth, of a boy who was broken by weakness but rebuilt by wisdom, of a man who stopped chasing love and started cultivating legacy, of a soul who turned silence into strength, pain into purpose, and solitude into power. This was never about women. This was about becoming a man so powerful, so aligned, so whole, that everything else became a reflection of that inner kingdom. And now, I walk differently. I speak differently. I live differently. Because I am not who I was. I am who I chose to become. Looking back on everything I've lived, everything I've faced, every storm I endured, I now understand what all of it was for. Every moment of rejection, every sleepless night questioning my worth, every instance I felt invisible or discarded. They weren't signs of my failure, they were invitations to rise. Invitations to evolve. Invitations to meet the man I was always meant to become. And this is what most people will never understand. Transformation never begins in comfort. It starts in pain. It starts in the lowest point. When you're broken, when you're forgotten, when you're tired of pretending. That's when the seed of rebirth is planted, and only those who have the courage to sit with their own darkness can ever rise into their light. That's what happened to me. I died in that old version of myself. Not physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And in that burial, I found the blueprint for something greater. I often hear people say things like, "You've changed," as if that's a criticism. But what they don't realize is that change is not optional, it's essential. You either evolve or you rot. You either grow or you decay, and I chose to grow. I chose to face myself, to dissect my weaknesses, to confront my addictions, to dismantle my excuses. I chose discipline when comfort was easier. I chose purpose when distraction was more appealing. I chose solitude when validation was tempting. And those choices changed everything. Not instantly, but progressively. Not loudly, but powerfully. Until one day, I looked in the mirror and didn't see a boy trying to be liked anymore. I saw a man who had earned his own respect. And that was the moment I knew. I didn't need applause, I didn't need approval, I didn't need permission. I was whole. And what makes this journey even more powerful is that I didn't become this man by following others. I became him by building myself, block by block, with the tools of Stoic philosophy. I stopped being a victim of emotions and started becoming the master of them. I stopped chasing external highs and started building internal stillness. I stopped needing control and started embracing acceptance. I let go of what I couldn't influence and poured everything I had into what I could. My discipline, my focus, my principles. And that's where everything shifted. Because when you change your internal world, the external world becomes powerless over you. This is what modern men need to understand. The world will always try to pull you out of yourself. Society wants you reactive, distracted, addicted to validation, chasing status, competing for women, proving yourself through noise. But that is not where your power lies. Your power lies in detachment, in presence, in intentional living. A man grounded in Stoic philosophy doesn't need to impress. He radiates. He doesn't beg, he attracts. He doesn't chase chaos. He builds peace. And that's the kind of man I became. Not perfect, but centered. Not fearless, but unshakable. Not emotionless, but emotionally sovereign. I remember when my younger cousin came to visit me, struggling with the same identity crisis I once had. He asked me, "How do you stop caring what others think?" I paused and told him the truth. You don't stop caring, you stop needing. Because the moment you stop needing approval to validate your existence, you become dangerous. In the best way, you start moving from purpose, not popularity. You start choosing alignment over attention. You stop negotiating your values for belonging, and slowly you become untouchable, not because you're superior, but because you're rooted. And that's what women began to feel when they met me. Not a man performing, not a man chasing, but a man who had nothing to prove and everything to offer. A man whose presence didn't beg for affection, but made others want to rise to meet him. And that's what true masculine energy is. Not domination, but direction. Not aggression, but groundedness. Not arrogance, but certainty. And when a man carries that energy, he becomes the rarest thing in the world, a sanctuary, a place of calm in a world full of chaos. And that's what I had become. But the journey doesn't end there. It never does. Because growth has no finish line. Mastery has no final destination. Every day is another opportunity to refine your path, to test your values, to strengthen your resolve. I still wake up early. I still train with intention. I still study. I still observe my emotions. Because I know that the moment I stop doing these things, the old self waits at the door, ready to creep back in. And I will never allow that version of me to return. Not because I hate him, but because I've outgrown him. I've seen what I'm capable of. I've tasted what true self-respect feels like. I've touched the depth of peace that only a disciplined man can access. And I won't trade that for anything. Not for comfort, not for validation, not even for love. Because here's the final truth I've learned. When you become a man of high value, you don't fear loss. You understand it's part of the process. People will come and go. Some will admire your strength, others will be intimidated by it. Some will rise with you, others will resent your rise. But none of that matters. Because your peace does not depend on others staying, it depends on you staying true to your code. That's the Stoic way, and that's the only way worth living. So if you've listened to my story until this final breath, understand this isn't just about me, it's about you. It's about what you choose to do now. You've heard the truth. You've felt the fire. You've seen what's possible. The question is, will you rise? Will you build? Will you walk away from weakness and embrace your strength? Will you stop begging for attention and start embodying presence? Will you stop being a prisoner to your emotions and become the king of your own mind? Because if you do, not if you commit, if you walk this path with courage, you'll discover what I discovered. That every setback was preparation, every rejection was redirection, and every ounce of pain was just pressure shaping you into the masterpiece you were meant to be. This is your time. This is your moment. Not tomorrow. Not next year. Now. Be the man who walks with discipline. Be the man who speaks with clarity. Be the man who chooses truth over comfort. Be the man who women respect, not because he begs, but because he builds. Be the man who rewrites the narrative of masculinity, not with noise, but with silent power. Be the man who stops chasing and becomes the one who is pursued. Because when you become that man, nothing and no one can take your power ever again. Thank you for walking with me through this story. If this message ignited something within you, then don't let it fade. Subscribe, share, comment, take action. Not for me, but for the man inside you that's waiting to rise. You are the prize. You are the force. You are the standard. Now go and become it.